welcome to Shift Happens. In this episode, we're going to go over the brand new 2019 Aprilia Tuono factory. Now, this is a special bike. Before this bike, I owned a 2017 Tuono factory, and this new bike to the 2019 model is very similar, minus some different livery. But the biggest difference is the suspension. This has the new Öhlins EC 2.0 electronic semi-active suspension. This is the same suspension that's used currently in the Panigale V4S as well as the R1M. This is the first time we're seeing it used in a naked street bike as opposed to a super bike. So it lots to talk about. And more importantly, since we've already, this bike in particular gives us the ability to compare the effects, the strengths of the semi-active suspension versus the standard Öhlins fixed suspension, while holding all other things equal, because I still have access to my old 2017 Tuono. So that's for a later installment. For now, we're just going to go around and we're just going to go over do a brief analysis of the semi-active suspension, how it works in the real world, and what benefits it provides over the standard fixed Öhlins suspension. So we're going to go on my, this is the usual test route I use. It's bumpy, it's curvy, it's strewn with dust and sometimes gravel. It's not the ideal, when you think of a good motorcycle road, this is not it. But it's really representative of the roads we see in the real world. We don't all live on the foothills of Glendower Mountain Road, or we don't always have access to glass smooth surfaces and beautiful corners and banked corners that offer perfect visibility. So what really matters in the real world are bikes that give us a sense of comfort. Bikes that offer seating positions that have good visibility, bikes that have good transitional response, bikes that you feel you can always change direction quickly without getting the balance of the bike upset. All of a sudden you can induce enough leverage to make bikes turn. So this bike really is you could argue the perfect street bike. And how much better did Aprilia make it with the new suspension? So here you see our video. At the top left you see visual on the front forks and how they're compressing and rebounding in response to road irregularities. So that's going to be something important to look at when I start describing this road and how the bike is performing on. This road's bumpy, as I mentioned, and typically on this road, the bikes that perform very well are long travel suspension bikes like KTM Super Dukes and Super Adventures and BMW GSs, things that are able to absorb these massive bumps without losing contact with the ground. Now, of course, you can set up a standard Tuono, earlier model without electronic suspension to perform well in these roads. By performing well, I mean absorbing the bumps. You can back off all the compression and rebound settings and make it so that it goes over these bumps as you see here, nice and smooth and without really making me leave my seat too often. However, when you soften up the suspension, static suspension, what you're left with is a bike that dives and squats. Squats in your braking and dives in your braking and squats in your acceleration, and might be slow might not offer the transitional response you would want. So there's always a compromise with fixed suspension. The idea behind the semi-active like Öhlins suspension is that it's able to discern between different riding events, like for a steady state cruise, going in a straight line without leaning over at the train direction, without braking, straight as an arrow. You can set up the suspension to be super soft. But as soon as the IMU, as soon as the computers detect the bike starting to lean or brake or add some yaw or accelerate, it recognizes another event happening and then it stiffens up accordingly. So with this suspension, you can see on this part of the road in particular, it's bumpy, it's got corners, it's reasonably high speed. I blacked out the, the speedometer for this test. for obvious reasons. But usually on this road, when the bike's leaned over on these bumps, it's it's not very it's not very comforting. When you're leaned over hitting bumps, what happens? Your suspension no longer works well because the forks aren't perpendicular with the ground. So now your frame starts acting like a suspension. Your tire starts acting like a suspension. But in this case, since we have the adaptive suspension being, softly damped, or offering a very soft settings under these roads, it performs really well. It transmits most of the force right into the fork, right into the shock, and not to the tire and not to the chassis. So this bump coming up here in particular, you'll see there's a section which bottoms out almost all cars and all bikes right here. Replay that bit again, you'll see I didn't really I didn't get knocked off my seat. The suspension didn't bottom out fully. It was remarkable. Prior to this bike, I had at the same time, like I mentioned earlier, 2017 Tuono as well as a 2015 Super Duke. Now I've always been going back and forth between the two. They're both modified, both have exhaust tunes, and I calibrated myself. Both had the suspension set up by Catalyst Reaction, and they represented as good as you can get them set up for any given condition. But generally, I preferred the Tuono on the racetrack. The Tuono performed better than the Super Duke. It just had a better ergos, better chassis control, better front end feel, and on most weekend rides through Lake Berryessa or through some nice high-speed sweeping smooth corners, the Tuono was the bike to pick. However, on this particular road, which I go on the way to the gym all the time, the Super Duke tend to perform better because of the suspension being more compliant. This is the first time I've ridden a Tuono that does it better than the Super Duke. This electronic suspension is remarkable. The way you can kind of separate the damping characteristics between the steady state, cornering, and braking and acceleration, and you really do get the best of both worlds. It's almost eerie. As a matter of fact, having ridden for so many years now, you get used to a bike which is set up to be, reasonably stiff for performance, and you get used to knowing how it's going to feel in a corner or over bumps, or you expect to get your teeth rattled a little bit. But with this new suspension, it's weird. It almost takes a while to get used to because, you're soft and it's comfortable, and then you get into a corner, you expect to be floaty and pitchy and divey, and it doesn't do any of that. It makes you feel like, you could have taken that corner a lot harder, a lot faster. And usually, you get used to kind of skipping around in corners with bumps. You get used to kind of the front end kind of chattering and losing a little bit of contact path with the ground and things like that. But you don't really feel that anymore. I mean, there's some, obviously, as in extreme cases, you'll feel that. Most people get off this bike, this new suspension, this new bike, and will kind of scratch your head and feel, oh, that felt really strange. But it's not strange in the way that you still have all the same road feel, you still have all the same feedback you would on a fixed suspension bike, but your brain takes a little bit of time to acclimate to not getting beaten up. And a couple other things I noticed. The EC2 suspension is very clever. When you do wheelies, when you come down from a wheelie, it seems like it softens up compression to make it, make the impact on the ground less hard. Clever little things like that where you don't expect, but it does it, and does it really, really well. So what this means is, it allows you to cover speed at a faster rate. Simple as that, because you're not, you just get used to the newfound capability of the bike. Everything is just more compliant and more exploitable. That's a word I use, and I don't use it very often in cars and bikes because there's really not that many. It's rare when you come across a bike or car which is truly exploitable on the road without having to ride like a total ass. So one could make an argument that this new Tuono, the 2019 Tuono factory, is the best street bike you can buy. And in Till I ride something better, I tend to agree. Prior to this, I could not say that about the 2017. I would say, well, there was arguments for the Super Duke, because in certain areas the Super Duke was better than the Tuono. Maybe not many areas, but some areas which count. Some areas which would disqualify the Tuono as being the best bike, period. But with the new 2019, I think it's a very, very strong argument can be made that the new Tuono is the best road bike you can get. So with that being said, we'll talk more about this bike and maybe definitely do a comparison between my 2017 now that they're equally modified with forged rims and exhaust and suspension and a custom dyno too. And that'll really drive home the differences. But for now, I think we have a lot to talk about with the suspension. Now that we have the ability to do some direct A/B comparisons, we can kind of get more involved with the setup specifics and things like that. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll have plenty more coming soon. Thank you. Please like and subscribe, and of course, as always, ride safe.